Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Political State from the Oklahoman. I'm Ben Felder. Joining me in this first segment from the DIG team, of which I'm a part of, is Meg Wingerter. Meg, welcome to the studio. Welcome to Political State. This is your first time here, right?
It is. Thanks
for
having me.
I think you get a mug or something when you're on your first appearance, so we'll have to make sure you get that. But Meg, we got you here in this first segment because I really want to talk to you about a story that you've already written. It was a week ago, last Sunday, in the paper, taking a look at the Oklahoma Health Department. Maybe a lot of people are familiar with that there were some issues with some money management last year. $30 million went missing. It's quite a big deal, and I think your story last Sunday was complex, but was a great narrative of really what happened and the players that were involved. And this wasn't necessarily an issue of corruption, at least not that we've seen, but maybe just an issue of not paying attention to warning signs and just some bad money management. So real quick, give us a breakdown of what the situation was.
Okay. Well, the health department had been overspending for quite some time. We know it was at least back in 2016, possibly as far back as 2011. And as you said, there's no evidence that's been uncovered that anyone was lining their own pockets or using it on something frivolous like expensive travel. It seemed to all be going towards health programs, but the problem was they were spending more on those worthy programs than they had to spend. And this was able to happen because of the way their accounting system is set up. In theory, when you have certain sources of funding, like federal grants, there are very strict limits on what you can spend that for. You're only supposed to use it for permitted uses. But the way they held their money, it was all put together in basically one big bucket, one account. And so it was up to basically the employees to track very carefully, okay, do we have enough money for all of these different programs, and we're not commingling anything in a way that we shouldn't. And that was not happening. They just were allowing that spending to go on as long as there was money in the account. So inevitably they ended up spending more than they should have. At one point, I believe it was in July, it got down to $15 in their main account, and they had a $600,000 bill that they had to pay in short order. So
yeah, running out of money really quick. And like you said, I mean, the two things that were really fascinating to me about this story is, one, is there were some employees that pointed out some issues. I mean, there were some employees that were in charge of different departments that had to pay, pay bills or pay vendors that were told that, hey, the money doesn't exist. And you do a really good job of outlining the story. The second thing that was really fascinating to me is technically the budget computer program is meant to kind of solve this problem in a way. You're not allowed to essentially spend more than you have on the computer. That if it says you have so much money and you try to take some more than that out, I don't know if there's a buzzer that goes off or whatever it is, but it makes it very clear. And in your story, some of the employees were basically doing off-the-book budget keeping. I mean, this was the equivalent of just putting a tape over the check engine light. I mean, it was telling you there was a problem and just ignoring it, right?
Yeah. What the system they have, they've got basically a two-sided system. There's this old 1970s mainframe that the health department has that they use for their bookkeeping. And that's an incredibly detailed system. It tells you right down to the specific account and the specific program, how much money do you have here? Do you have that money in your account? And also, do you have it included in your budget to be able to spend this? But that's not the system that cuts the checks. That system is at the Office of Management and Enterprise Services, and that's not so detailed. That's the one where they basically had it in a bucket and would keep paying as long as there was money in the account without really checking, should this money be used for this purpose? So yeah, with their old mainframe system, it was telling them, you can't record these costs because we show you don't have it in your budget to do that. And employees were just, basically recording in spreadsheets of that we spent this money and we should be paying it back, but then it just, they had just overspent to the point that the money wasn't paid back. And I also want to be clear, it's not that this was rogue employees. There were people at the top who were also ignoring this.
Yeah, I mean, from the very top, really. I mean, as your story shows. Well, there's two reasons why I think this is a really relevant thing to talk about right now. One is because your story just came out, and this is still a fresh issue, and we'll talk here in a moment about what it looks like going forward. The second thing here in the second half of the program, the rest of the political state crew will be with me. We're going to be kind of talking about a Republican gubernatorial candidate forum that the Oklahoman's hosting on Monday, and one of the big talking points of conservative lawmakers is always cutting down on waste. I mean, the standard theory is, Democrats want to hike your taxes, and maybe it's a little more complex than that, and the Republicans want to find that waste. And a lot of times you hear that waste, and people will criticize and say, hey, where's the waste? What are you talking about? But right here, this has been one thing that a lot of lawmakers have pointed to, and some lawmakers held some hearings late last year, right? Tell us a little bit about that, and what were they? What kind of questions did they have, and then what was the result of that?
Well, mostly they were just trying to get their arms around how did this happen, because I mean, like most of us in the public, they're not finance professionals, and you look at it, and most of us, we look at it and say, okay, if we spend more than we have, we know our checkbook, our bank account's going to be empty at some point. So how did this happen? They never issued a final report or anything from that. It could come later, but basically they were just trying to figure out what happened and if it could happen again, which unfortunately it appears that it could. Nobody's brought forth any evidence of other departments who are in that situation now, but basically what they found was there weren't the checks necessary to make sure that something like this wasn't happening. There wasn't the level of oversight you'd need.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I expect this health department story to be brought up at least at the forum and by many candidates, many of them talk about kind of trying to cut down on government waste, and this seems to be a prime example. At least when $30 million you overspend, it seems like there's a problem. So where do things stand going forward? What do you feel like what are some things that you're watching for in terms of responses and what's next for the health department? I mean, there's a round of layoffs recently as a way to address this money mismanagement. So what's next?
Well, before I say, could I comment a little on your mentioning of waste?
Yeah, please.
I mean, I don't know that it's a textbook example of waste because these were health-related programs. You could argue how much you should be spending on different health programs, but it wasn't, you couldn't say that it was totally frivolous. It seemed
waste
more
not in its end result per se, just not waste maybe in not having a tighter leash on the money management, right? Is that what you're saying?
That there wasn't they didn't have people who were closely monitoring, this is what we can afford and this is what we can't afford.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So moving forward, what's next for the department?
Well, it gets a little messy because, as you know, they still haven't, the budget process for the next fiscal year at the legislature really hasn't gotten very far yet, so they don't know what the legislature is going to give them to work with. Under the new interim commissioner, Tom Bates, they're still trying to track down exactly where all the money went and figure out, okay, these are our core services we have to provide. How many people and how much money do we need to do this? And if we have any budget left over, what would we use that for? What else might we be able to afford to do? So it's kind of, they're in a very difficult place because they don't have a clear, this is how much we need. They don't know exactly how much they need to ask for, and they also don't know what the legislature is inclined to give them, so they can't really then reverse engineer of, okay, if you give us this much money, here's what we're going to be able to do with it. You've got some people who are really working hard on it. I don't want to talk down the health department in any way, but they are in a tough spot right now.
Yeah, definitely. And once again, the big question, what's the legislature going to do? They're trying to wrap up that budget process here over the next couple of weeks. And in many ways, I mean, the legislature kind of bailed them out last year with kind of an emergency. And injection of cash to try to keep things going. Real quick before we conclude this part, tell me. I mentioned there were layoffs in the department, and partly in a response to that. What did those layoffs look like? Where did it hit the hardest?
Well, most of it was in the county health departments. There were some from the central offices, but the vast majority of people that they employ are actually out in the counties. You know, nurses, health educators, people like that. And so unfortunately they took the most of the layoffs, and you know, that is translating into people may have to wait longer for certain services. They may have to drive further because, you know, a service is not available at every location. Some of that is still being worked out, and it also raised some concerns for people, like the state epidemiologist said about. She was concerned that, you know, if there's an outbreak of a disease, they really rely on those public health nurses to do some of the outreach and contacting people who might have been exposed to get their arms around the situation and also contain it. So it's, I don't think it's what anyone would have wanted, but with having to cut costs very quickly, they didn't have a lot of other options. Yeah, and in fact, you did some reporting on this a couple months ago on where those layoffs hit the hardest, which you can actually find on at newsok.com/dig. It was actually our first dig project story that you did, diving into exactly where those layoffs are happening. And once again, your really great story from last Sunday is online as well on the health department. So, well, Meg, thanks so much for coming in, telling us a little bit about it, and we know you're going to continue to follow this as it continues to move forward. Thanks for having me. Yeah, you bet. Well, we're going to take a quick break here at Political State. When we come back, I'll be joined with the Political State crew. We're going to talk a little bit about that Monday candidate forum. The Republican candidates for governor are going to be coming together as we are just a couple months away from the Republican primary, the primaries in general. We're going to take a quick break. You're watching and listening to Political State from the Oklahoman. Hello and welcome back to Political State from the Oklahoman. I'm Ben Felder here in the Oklahoman's video studios. Joining me is the Political State crew, Dale and Justin. Gentlemen, welcome.
Hey, thank you.
It's Friday. We are a few days away from, what are we calling this? The Rumble in the Jungle or whatever. I don't know what kind of clever marketing term we've come up with. But GOP gubernatorial candidate forum that the Oklahoman is hosting. You don't like the name, Justin? No. It's hosting on Monday. 6 of the candidates, probably the 6 top candidates, are going to be there answering a variety of questions at the theater at the Museum of Art. So looking forward to that. That'll be one of 3 forums that the Oklahoman is hosting. We'll also have one for the Democrats and I believe the Libertarians as well. But first up is the Republicans, an important nomination to try to get out of the primary. They're likely going to be the front runner, whoever that is, going into November in this red state so far continues to be. I'm just kind of curious, what are we these candidates have been crisscrossing the state already. They've talked to lots of outlets. There's probably nothing that we're going to really learn. But I'm curious, what are some of the most important issues that you would like to hear the candidates speak to? Well,
first and foremost, state revenue and the budget. It's been the most important topic in the state for the last 2 or 3 years, if not longer. And it will continue to be an important topic. Even though Oklahoma's economy seems to be rebounding a bit, and the legislature this year will have less of a worry about how to find revenue. There's still a lot of problems that particularly Republicans see in how Oklahoma collects and spends its own money. So personally, I would like to see the Republican nominee for governor have an opinion on what Oklahoma should do about tax and spending. Yeah, we're liable to hear the word waste. We kind of talked about that in the first segment with Meg Wingerter talking about her investigation into the health department. That's probably going to even come up. That's an example of it. But how specific do lawmakers need to be? I mean, you always hear waste. We need to cut waste, but how specific do you feel like they need to be? It depends on how specific the questioner forces the question. Well, it's going to be me, so tell me how specific I need to be, Dale. You always hear about complaints about waste, fraud, and abuse. I have seen some lists out there of people who have identified what they believe as waste, fraud, and abuse. But for a candidate to come out and say that is rare, right? For a candidate to come out and say, I want to eliminate this, I want to eliminate that. Here's an example of waste, and this is how we're going to get rid of it. And I think maybe Gary Richardson is one of the few who has actually said what they want to do to eliminate
state auditor.
Yeah, the state auditor and the turnpike and all this. But generally, you have candidates who just say the magic words waste, fraud, and abuse, and leave it at that.
Yeah. No, I'm sorry. I mistake. So Gary Richardson, you're saying gets kind of targeted the turnpikes. Gary Jones, the state auditor, expect him to maybe have some examples as well. That's I do think. I mean, revenue is going to be a big one, and it always is. I was talking for an upcoming story on Sunday, taking a look back at the teacher strike and some issues there. Starting with Dave Bond from OCPA, the conservative think tank here in Oklahoma, and he was telling me that he thought that the appetite from the public for more taxes is going to be even lower now, and the people are going to scrutinize even more government spending after we've seen such a large tax increase passed. And I thought he made a kind of a good point, because we saw that over $400+ million in new tax increases to fund a teacher pay raise and some education funding, which was a big lift for lawmakers. Even I think a lot of conservative Oklahomans thought, okay, maybe we need this, but now we've done it. So now we're going to scrutinize even more. I don't know that we've entered this new era of tax increases. Maybe we'll see another one. We'll talk about that here in a moment. But we haven't entered this new progressive era where Oklahoma now is just a spend freely and raise taxes state. So I wonder if now that we've seen that, the response is going to be from candidates to say, hey, we passed this taxes. I may not have agreed with it, but we have to be even more careful with our spending.
You have to keep in mind, though, and I think Democrats and liberals will raise this point, that yes, we have more money going to schools, but you have to imagine over the last 10 years that the sort of the per pupil average of money spent on schools has decreased. So relatively, schools have for years gotten less money, and so the moment you give them a little bit extra, there's going to be this so much intense scrutiny on how they're spending it. I'm not sure that's going to be the case, but certainly among Republicans, I imagine it will. They'll find ways to nitpick and identify things that maybe a school isn't doing right. Or find ways to consolidate administration across the state, which is a goal, a stated goal and policy goal from this government.
Yeah, and I would expect some candidates to say, hey, look, now we did the tax increase thing. Now we need to go at the cutting wasteful spending thing, and we need to do it even more so now that we increase those taxes. Justin, what are you kind of looking forward to the most?
Dale's absolutely right. You have to start naming at some point what you're going to cut. If you want to cut fraud, waste, abuse, name it. And I think the Oklahoman last Sunday gave somebody, a candidate, whichever one wants to take it up, a pretty clear example of overspending. I think that's a better term for what happened at the health department. But that's a clear example there where, and I think we've seen Kevin Stitt on Twitter take up that mantle as kind of, something has to be done. We can't allow agencies to overspend like this. So I think you may see that Monday night. I'm curious to see from the candidates which candidates they think are the front runners, and you'll see that because they'll start going after them. I mean, as we get closer to this primary, they're going to start picking on whoever they think is the front runner to try to bring them down a little bit. I mean, there are two ways to beat a candidate: prop yourself up and bring somebody else down a little bit. They've all been propping themselves up, and that's what you do at these things. At some point, they're going to start, knocking the ones that they think are up at the top, and that's the best way sometimes to find out who is winning, is and leading at this point, not winning, but is to see who they start going after, and we may start seeing criticisms of the lieutenant governor or of Mick Cornett.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we've seen a little bit of that. I mean, I think Lamb has been, if I have to think, I don't know that we've seen a lot of attacks on each other. I could be wrong about that, but just in kind of the general press of the campaign so far, haven't seen too much of it. But what I have seen has been mainly directed at Lieutenant Governor Todd Lamb, which makes sense for a couple reasons. But one, I mean, he's the one, Gary Jones is the state auditor, so he's an elected official as well. But, Lamb is technically, he's in the thick of it. I mean, he is an elected official. And I think one of the themes you're seeing out of this campaign so far, as you normally do, is it's going to take an outsider to fix our mess. And Lamb is not, he's not an outsider.
He's tried to become an outsider.
He's tried, yeah.
By not involving himself in the legislative debates, by removing himself from the governor's cabinet, and generally being as far as he can away from all of this debate about tax increases and how to spend money, and even the teacher walkout.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't see him up there at the Capitol, so he's I think as far as how to win a campaign, he's probably doing the right thing, like staying away from that muddled mess that is the legislature right now, and instead of focusing on introducing yourself to people. But does that put him at a disadvantage from when he stands up there with the other Republican candidates and they say, why weren't you doing anything, right? And I kind of hope you asked that too. So where were you as the sort of the number 2 person in government? Where were you as a leader in trying to coax some sort of agreement out of Republicans and Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, you've seen him respond to that by, I mean, he's been critical of Governor Fallon and the legislature. I don't know that he's thrown her under the bus, aggressively, but I mean, he has made it very clear that he would do things differently.
Sure.
What the specifics are though of what doing differently means, maybe there's some ambiguity there. I'm really curious to see what we see from Mick Cornett, so the former mayor of Oklahoma City. He was somebody that you saw a lot of people kind of talking about him as a candidate before he decided to run. It seemed kind of natural that he may run. I mean, he's been a successful governor by a lot of metrics, or mayor of Oklahoma City by a lot of metrics, but he hasn't really been. He hasn't really shaped a clear policy or campaign platform. I don't know. You think that's fair to say? I mean, in terms of, he's not been someone that's really dived into the details yet so far, and that makes sense in some ways, because part of his game right now is getting name recognition out there, getting around the state. You don't usually start. There's actually an episode of West Wing where they're starting on the presidential campaign with I don't remember the guy's name, but one of the guys, and he wants to talk about his education policy, and you're like, no, just shake hands. Like, it's just retail politics right now. You don't want to get into it, and so that kind of feels where Mick Cornett has been at.
Well, think about it this way: you're standing in an election with several other people who will probably have very similar policy goals as you. And the goal of a primary, obviously, is to differentiate yourself among the other candidates in a positive way. As you get into the general election, it's easier to say, this is how my plan is going to be different from this other person's plan. If it ends up being Mick Cornett versus Drew Edmondson, for example, it's going to be a lot easier for Mick Cornett to say, here's my policy ideas. And Drew Evans's policy ideas are bad for these reasons, mine are good for these reasons. But when you have 6 or 7 Republicans all together on the same ballot, for the most part, their answers are going to be relatively the same.
Yeah, but I feel like some people have looked at Cornett as expecting maybe a little bit of difference from him, and maybe the people that are looking at him for that are not Republican voters. I mean, when I think about the people you've seen a lot of people who would be described as moderates, maybe left of center, who have really, were enthusiastically supporting Cornett when he decided to run. And maybe for a lot of, if you're a Democrat in this state, maybe Cornett is the Republican you feel like you can support for a few different reasons. But you're right, pleasing them, that job doesn't come until you've won the primary yet. And as we've talked about, that's, there's a zig and a zag from January to November.
And politics is surprising. I wouldn't, if I were a Democrat, I wouldn't get my hopes up about Mick Cornett being my preferred candidate of choice, because he's Republican. He's running in the Republican primary, and he has to maintain the loyalty of the people who put him into the nomination if he gets the nomination. He's not going to all of a sudden be a big old lefty if he gets the nomination. I don't think he is, but it's not going to be a dramatic shift in his personal politics just because you're a Democrat and you like him better than the other Republicans.
Yeah, and he's been, I think it comes from not because you've seen him be a really progressive politician in the past, but he's been a moderate, and I think he would say that's what a mayor is. This is not technically the mayor of Oklahoma City. That's a nonpartisan position. So you're not a Republican, you're not a Democrat. You know, and maybe he can use that in the general election to say, hey, I'm running as a Republican, but you know, I come from City Hall where it's just about getting things done. It's not about R versus D. And I think sometimes the national media kind of paints him as coming from a city that has aggressively used sales tax increases to kind of reinvent himself. That kind of sounds like a really progressive thing. I'm actually not sure that it is. I think it's actually kind of a pretty conservative way of raising taxes, because it's this is a pay for things as you go type of system. When you look at maps, I mean, everything we've built with it has been paid for with cash, instead of taking out bonds and large amounts of debt. But yeah, I'm just kind of interested to see what kind of how Cornette presents himself. Did you see the video? There was a video that was circulating of him. Actually, we shot it. Chris Castile shot it at a forum where he was talking about the teacher walkout. This was pre the walkout, and he said that he didn't think that it was the wisest decision to walk out. He wasn't. I don't know that he said he was against the tax increase package, but maybe kind of insinuated that he was against it, and that's pretty much in line with many of the Republican candidates. But he got really beat up for. At the end of the video, I think it was like a 10-minute video, and it was all about the teacher walkout. And the last one, somebody asked him what he thought about gun violence and what the answer to gun violence is, and he said that's a tough one, and I'm not sure I've got a great answer for that, or I don't know that I've got a brilliant idea about that. And it got played as he was answering the walkout. It was a mischaracterization of what he was saying. But I also think it kind of spoke to how people see him a little bit. Like, all right, we want some substance. We want some answers, because he's been an answers kind of guy in the past.
He's been intentionally vague so far in the campaign, and that's played pretty well, I think. But at some point, yeah, he'll have to lay out the differences between himself and the other Republicans. And if we get close to the primary and people get the sense that he is leading, you will get criticisms of his record as not being conservative enough. And I think you'll have other Republicans trying to paint that picture that he is a moderate or even left of center, which is not accurate, but I think it will come up in the primary quite a bit.
Yeah, and like I said, that vagueness is probably by design.
So far it's been a pretty good idea, but as you get closer, actually, it would play well for him in a general election, I think. So I think his history plays well in a general election, and his background. So if he can get there, I think he's pretty well set. But he has to get past the Republican primary first, where he is going to take challenges and accusations that he's not conservative enough.
Yeah, we talked about Lamb and Cornette. I think they kind of feel like probably feel like the top, the leaders of the pack. Anybody outside that group do you feel like still has a fighting chance that could really make some noise? I was kind of surprised. I mean, we're talking about Gary Jones, Gary Richardson, Dan Fisher. I was kind of surprised we didn't see more of them at the walkout. I wasn't surprised that we didn't see Stitt, Cornette, or Lamb much, but I thought surely maybe one of these second-tier candidates would kind of use this as an opportunity. Now, I mean, they probably wouldn't be well received by teachers, but in terms of at least talking about the issue more than we saw to try to play up to Republican primary voters.
So your question is, are we going to see any great influence from these other candidates besides the
anybody still have a chance you feel like to?
It's hard to say. We know that Gary Richardson has the money to make an influence in the election, even past the primary. If he decides to keep spending money, if he doesn't win the primary and he decides to keep spending money, he can certainly make an influence then. Somebody like Gary Jones is well connected in the party and
still has a lot of fans. People are still pretty
won 2 statewide elections.
Grateful for the work that he did. I think there's going to be some Republican voters like, you know what? I mean, I'm going to vote for him if for no other reason than to, he was good for Republicans in this state. Yeah,
and you might find a lot of people on election day sit down and say, Todd Lamb is the front runner, and he'd probably be a good governor. But in my heart, I agree with someone like Gary Jones or someone like Dan Fisher. And do people throw their vote behind who they who they're closest to politically, or who they think could beat a Democrat in the general election, or who they think is the most popular? I don't know how it'll all turn out. I don't know the science behind what a person does in the voting booth, but these candidates all have their dedicated core group of voters.
And Fisher,
Yeah.
a religious, anti-abortion.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all anti-abortion. Fisher's
Yeah.
really anti-abortion.
And so it probably just comes down to that. I can't wait to find out.
Yeah,
I'm
well, that's going to be
excited.
Yeah, I mean Monday. If you can't join us in person, and I think we may be already filled up. I should have known that before we came on. But you can watch live. We'll be
Yes.
streaming it live on Facebook and newsok.com, and the forum kicks off at 6:30 on Monday. Still taking ideas for questions. We've got for the bulk of it put together.
Gonna have any
but-
gotcha questions.
Any gotcha questions? I don't practice gotcha journalism. That's not my style. But you have been helpful in the things that you want to see me press on. I will try to do my best. There are some questions where I think it's good, where we will be clear, like, hey, you're going to have a minute to talk or 90 seconds to talk, but we need a yes or a no on this. Like whether, I think it's important to know where they stood on, some of them have already answered, on the tax increase that we saw. Where do they stand on that? Where do they stand on capital gains? How would they vote, yes or no, on these issues? And it's going to be easy for some of them to say it's in the past now. I wouldn't have to worry about it. But this is the lens that we're looking at the political landscape.
Or would you sign the bill or veto the
Would you
bill
sign the
for
bill? Yeah.
considering the position they're running for?
And I think we've seen some that have said no. We've seen some that said yes. We've seen some that said I probably would sign it, even though I don't agree with it. And and I think that says a lot about what kind of governor would they be during what's kind of been a crisis right now for the state. Well, much quieter week, huh? This week at the Capitol for you?
It's been a lot quieter.
Yeah.
Obviously, still a lot of teachers up there. The gallery still got a lot of people in it. And when the House adjourned for lunch, everyone went to the little cafe right next to the press room. There was a line still out the door.
So it kind of felt like a little bit reminiscent
Yes.
of the past 2 weeks with
Yeah,
crowds right
yeah.
outside the door.
You got to kind of wind down after something like that.
Yeah.
No, it's a lot quieter, and we may be out of there in a couple of weeks. May 4th is the stated goal. Who knows if we're actually going to get out by that time? But that's when a lot of the legislature wants to is hopefully going to wrap up their work, including passing a budget for this next year and a tax cut or a tax increase. Actually, the second tax increase in the last almost 30 years, and it's going to happen just a few weeks after the last one.
Well, maybe this is a tax and spend legislature now.
Yeah,
huh?
it is.
Yeah, maybe they're really up for this shit.
So many tax increases. Come on, guys.
Yeah, it's now it's about to be a streak with two, or one more on top of that. So how likely is the legislature ends early? Because they always say they want to end early, but it does seem like there may be a little bit more intentionality behind that.
I'd say maybe a 30% chance they get done by May the 4th. You've got a lot of wildfires up in western Oklahoma. Maybe that's going to get taken care of, but there may be some emergency money. Like they don't have any money in the rainy day fund that they can spend on that, so they may have to move some money around and figure out that maybe in the last 1% that the governor and everybody else was talking about, that they're still trying to figure out. That last 1% of the budget before they present it to the legislature. But there are a myriad of issues that can come up, a myriad of special interests that could push for more things to get done before the end of session. But I think if we get a budget on the floor or in committee and out of committee this next week, the chances for a May 4th adjournment goes up dramatically. Because I think I wrote a story about this. I think it's going to be in Sunday's edition of the Oklahoman that there's fatigue at the legislature. People are ready to go home. Some people are so ready to go home that they haven't run for re-election.
Yeah.
And I think a point can be made that once you get the budget done, which is really the only constitutionally mandated thing that the legislature has to do each year, once you get that done, you just go home.
Yeah.
Or at least down to one session now, though. We are in the regular session.
Yes.
We're out of the specials. What I always pronounce it sine die. I think there are some different pronunciations of the Latin there.
Sine die is, I think, the appropriate Latin pronunciation.
Okay, all right.
It's over.
Everybody calls it sine die. And if you follow me on Twitter, I always have a new Latin definition for what sine die means each time we have one.
I've noticed.
So maybe on May 4th we'll have the latest Latin translation for sine die.
So prestigious.
Yeah.
For a non-prestigious. Never mind. You talk about a lot of these people are tired. I think they are. They're tired. You said a lot of them aren't running for re-election. It's kind of what we've been hearing on the national front. I mean, it's happening in Oklahoma. A lot of lawmakers, particularly Republicans, are like, you know what? I'm not sure this is where I want to spend my time.
That's an effect of the walkout. We didn't talk as much until Dale wrote a Sunday story. I mean, that is. We talked about a lot of challengers getting in the races because of the education issue. We didn't talk as much about the burnout that can cause from legislators or in legislators. Not only the walkout, but the special sessions. And all those issues that could have led to that. I didn't really think about that issue as much until Dale just noted that.
It's been pretty much nonstop for like 14, 15, 16 months now.
Yeah.
And it's not only has it been nonstop, the legislative sessions, but it's been primarily about a couple of issues, raising taxes and figuring out the budget shortfall, which the budget shortfall has been an issue for 3 or 4 years now. So I think it's partially understandable if a young person, particularly someone my age or younger who's in the legislature, they got a family. You add on top of that the fact that the Legislative Compensation Review Board lowered their salary, and you take a look at your life and say, this is really frustrating. I don't know what I'm doing here, and I disagree with almost everything that the legislature's done, including that person's own votes. So so why not hit the road?
Yeah, and we've seen different types of candidates say that that did not refile, but we've seen some kind of young, kind of moderate Republicans, I think and that were maybe on the track for leadership at some point, or some leadership positions.
I don't know if I'd call it moderate, but
well,
more.
I mean, not moderate, but maybe less on the social,
mainstream,
more business focused.
I'm thinking of someone like Josh Cockcroft.
Yeah, exactly. Who
has led the Special Investigation Committee. He kind of surprised me that he was put in charge of that, but then it kind of made sense as time went on because of kind of how he composed himself during that entire ordeal of several investigations into waste, fraud, and abuse in the state of Oklahoma. And these started with the sexual harassment allegations of one of his fellow members. And so he decided that it was time to go. He had an opportunity back home around the Tecumseh area, I think is where he's from. And he's got a couple of young kids. He's 28 or 29 years old, I think. And he could stay in the legislature another 4 years, but he decided that it was time for him to go. And you've also got the Republican caucus chair, Elise Hall, who owns a business here in the Oklahoma City metro area, and decided that she's gone. She's leaving. She's still in her 20s. Katie Hinkey, she just had a kid. She lives in Tulsa, and she was lamenting to me that she doesn't get to see her child very often, her brand new child, because she's stuck up here at the legislature. I think the kid's 3. It's not brand new, but a very young child. And so it's partially understandable that if there are people who weather that kind of thing in normal legislative years because they may feel like they're making a difference or doing good. But when you add on top of that the frustration that everyone's felt with the special sessions and the shortfalls and the persistent walkout pressure, I think it really builds on people, and it's understandable if they want to leave. Yeah,
well, definitely a tough year for the legislature. Although I bet there'll be a lot of people out there that aren't feeling too sorry for them as well. But it does make the elections in November and June and then November maybe even a little bit more intriguing to see how that shapes out. Some of the power of the incumbency is going to be leaving some of these still Republican seats. There's mostly Republicans that chose not to run again. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that shapes out.
Yeah, 0 Democrats have resigned. The Democrats who are leaving office early are running for some other office.
Okay.
Yeah. And the worst part about it, Ben, is that I'm going to have to remember all these new names and all these new faces when I come back to
Well, we
the
will feel
legislature
sorry
next
for
year.
you.
Yeah.
But we'll get you a cheat sheet or something like that
Yeah.
with their names and photos, whoever that ends up being. So, well, that's going to do it for this week's episode of Political State. You can join us each and every week. You can also join us once again on Monday, GOP Gubernatorial Candidate Forum, 6:30. We're going to be streaming it live on Facebook and at newsok.com. Getting a look at some of the candidates for the Republican primary, asking them a variety of questions on some of the most important issues facing the state. Well, it's Justin and Dale. I'm Ben Felder. Thanks for watching and listening this week. We'll see you again next week for another edition of Political State.